There's a few things I wanted to say last week before we had to cancel because of snow. And if any of you have any questions, how as a staff we make decisions on snow days, Will Snyder will be happy to discuss it with you. But last week, I wanted to apologize. I tried to get the Ohio State Buckeyes to throw the game against Michigan like they did last year, but Ryan Day wouldn't comply because he told me his job was on the line. Secondly, I did want to thank Trevor for preaching through a very difficult passage in Romans 10. He's a great exegete. He's a wonderful gift to our church. If you haven't had a chance to listen to his sermon, to help navigate this very difficult portion of Scripture, I really recommend you listen to that passage. He did a great job. Some people have also mentioned that this should be a very easy week for me because I can just recycle last week's sermon. So I slept 7 straight days, Darcy. I did nothing. Because, pastors, we only work 1 day a week, which they tell you. However, there's a few complications in this. Number one, December has arrived, and that means it's time for Christmas messages again. Tradition demands it. We must talk about Christmas. In the same way many put on their Hallmark Christmas movies, raise your hand if you watched any Hallmark Christmas movies. Oh, Brian Bear. The last guy I would suspect would be the first hand up. Very surprising. Well, in the same way, if you are a long-time churchgoer, you want to be brought back to the manger where the baby is quietly sleeping. You want to visit old friends like Mary and Joseph as they listen to the little drummer boy rum-a-tum-tumming. And you want to wonder as you wander out under the sky with the wise men. As the great theologian Andy Williams tells us, it's the most wonderful time of year. But, however, with the reason why I had to do a revision on this is because as an exegetical preacher, we are in Romans 11, quite honestly, maybe one of the most complicated and nuanced portions of Scripture ever to preach on Romans, especially during Christmas time. It's complicated, it's confusing, and as for the average churchgoer, it's like trying to learn about continuous derivatives in elementary school. And if you don't know what I say, that's what I'm talking about. So I have revised what I have prepared last week. So last week I was going to talk about His people, but this is called His People Revised. So if you can, turn to Romans chapter 11, and we are going to read a few of the verses and then explain all of them. So I'm going to ask you, before we go in there, I'm going to ask you to stick with me. I know it's Sunday morning. I know many of you are thinking about what you're going to eat, but I'm going to ask you to think. Strap on your brain. And we're going to enter this passage. Here we go. Romans 11, verse 1. Paul is writing, and he's going to actually answer this question. I ask then, did God reject His people? That's what this whole passage is about. Did He reject His people? We're going to talk about what His people means. I want you to go to verse 5. He's going to talk about this remnant. So too, at the present time, that means in present reality, there is a remnant chosen by grace. And if it's by grace, that cannot be based on works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. In other words, this is the foundation for salvation for every group of people. Grace. We are never saved by works. No matter what religion you are, it's by grace, by God's gift, His goodness. And then look at verse 11. It's kind of the same bookend. Again, I ask, did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? He says, not at all. Now listen to the very end of verse 11. Rather, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles. The Gentiles is another phrase of saying everybody that's non-Jew. We are all Gentiles, non-Jews. So if you're looking for Christmas in this message, here it is. Salvation has come to us. That is the most succinct way to talk about what is Christmas about. Salvation has come to the Gentiles. In the book of Luke, chapter 2, verse 10, the angel Gabriel came down to some lowly shepherds, keeping watch over their flock by night. And here's what he said to them. I bring you good news. That's where we get the word gospel. I bring you the gospel that will cause great joy for all people. So this news is not meant just for the Jews, but for all people. For all people. Gentiles, they're included too. It's just as Paul writes here, salvation has come to the Gentiles. What is this salvation, however? What does that mean? Because the word salvation means deliverance. Well, Matthew 2, another part of the Christmas story, 10 through 11, gets very specific. When the wise men saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Who did they worship? The child. They worshiped the child. The good news, the gospel, is found in a child, in a baby, small, tiny fingers, tiny toes, tiny nose. That little baby is where our salvation is found, because that child was and still is alive, but right now he's sitting at the right hand of God in reality, and he's the king. And his name's Jesus Christ. So you could say God himself has become our salvation. And when you take a second to ponder this, really there's nothing more fantastic and more, in a way, crazy than this. God, who made the mountains, who made you, became a baby. This baby made the stars. It's an amazing story. So that then brings us to Romans 11. That brings us to the beginning of Romans 11. Because now that Jesus has come to the Gentiles, is God now done with the Jews? Is he done with Israel? Can we say, oh, Israel completed their task, they can wipe their hands, and God now has moved on to us? Because the Jews did their job, right? The Messiah was born. Has God anything left for them to do? Is he done with them? But Paul even gets more specific. He says this, did he reject his people? Wait, what is he talking about? Did he reject his people? That is the question in Romans 11. The word reject means to cast away. So you could ask the question, did God cast away? The word actually means to thrust out. Did God thrust out the Jews? Is he done with Israel for good? Because we're living in a culture that believes that. Why? Why would they believe that? Well, because this baby who grew up, who performed amazing miracles, he then declared himself to be the king. He rode in on Jerusalem on a donkey, rode into the city of Jerusalem on a donkey. We call it Palm Sunday. The day he rode in on a donkey, in the book of Luke, Jesus says the Jews did not recognize the time of God's visitation. So instead, they took Jesus and handed him over to Pontius Pilate to be crucified. They rejected their king. They rejected their Messiah. So it seems to many scholars and theologians, and I'm talking some as influential as Luther and Calvin, that in return for their rejection of the Messiah, God the Father rejected them. Did God cast away his people, Israel? That is the question. That is the question that's actually troubled the church for the last 2,000 years. It's a huge question. In fact, I've been reading this book. It's a nice, tiny little book that's all about this singular question. It's 1,000 pages. I've perused it. I've read it, I skimmed it. But 1,000 pages on this question. If you want to know, the answer's in here, but I can make it simple for you. That's our job this morning. Our job is to answer this. Is Israel a castaway? That's simply our question. So, before we go into Romans, I want to give you 4 perspectives as I basically digest this, think through all of my comprehensive study. I believe when it comes to the estrangement of Israel with God, there's 4 prevalent views. I'm speaking in general terms. And then we'll get to which one do I think is real. You're going to have to discern that in a second. But here's the 4 views. View number 1 is this idea that Israel has been replaced by the church. So Israel, the nation, has been replaced by the church. It's known as replacement theory. The main idea is since the Messiah was rejected when he came as king, God rejected Israel and has replaced all of the promises with the church and his bride. We are now God's favored nation status. All the promises have been given to the church. The responsibility to be God's witness of the earth, in the earth, has been given to the church. And now we are the apple of his eye. Israel's importance as the vanguard of the messianic promises and traditions has been revoked because they reject Jesus, so they've been rejected. As John the Baptist once said, Israel must decrease while the church and Christ himself increases. That's view number 1. View number 2 sees the church as the new spiritual children of Abraham. We are the new Israel in an allegorical sense, and we have absorbed all the believing Jews. So the main idea of this is that the Christian church includes born-again Gentile believers and true Jewish believers, which we form the new people of Abraham. Together, we are the fulfillment of God's original promise to Abraham that he's going to have as many children as there's stars in the sky. So if you are a believing Jew right now, you've been included in the next phase of God's plan, the church. If you're an unbelieving Jew, tough luck. Tough luck. So in a way, some people say this is kind of similar to the first view, but instead of seeing promises as physical realities, in the second group, they are spiritual realities. It's allegorical. So then you have view number 3. This is what I'd call the dispensational view. This can be very technical. I'm not going to go into the technicality. I'm going to just generalize. In the dispensational view, the view that believes the nation Israel has been set aside for a season. God at this moment in history is giving us, the Gentiles, our day in the sun. I'm using the word bench because I think for Americans with sports-mindedness, you can understand this. Benched is simply to help make sense out of the dispensational view. Yeah, here you got a star quarterback, Israel. Israel is playing great. They got us ahead in the game. But in the end of the third quarter, they threw a few interceptions. So the coach benched him and put in the second stringers who finally get to see some action. If you notice, a bench player is not kicked off the team. They are sidelined late in the game. And yes, they will be put back in the game during the closing minutes when it gets close to pull the team ahead. That's the analogy of the dispensational view. And then the fourth view, and this is becoming more and more popular. You won't believe how popular this view is. It's the idea that the Jews are the climax of all history. That actually God's expression of himself is fully manifested in the Jewish tradition and religion. This is called, this has been popularized by this group called the Hebrew Roots Movement. They believe God's plan for humanity has always been to have his glory found in the nation Israel. They are the climax, all of their traditions. So even though they're a Christian-based movement, the followers believe that they, and all true believers for that matter, must keep the Old Testament Mosaic laws. They must keep Torah. They also believe that Jesus, we should address him as Yeshua because he is Messiah. They view the law as eternally binding and it's not abolished. They observe Sabbaths. They observe biblical feasts. They observe kosher laws. They can't eat bacon. Poor guys. No bacon. And they reject pagan holidays like Christmas. They don't agree with Christmas. And that is the Hebrew Roots movement, or those who see the fulfillment of all things in Judaism. There's two big issues with this that I just want to make relevant, and we're seeing this play out in our own day and age. The first one is, what do you do with the promises of the Old Testament? Like Israel is going to start, have a temple again, that they're going to go back in the land again. What do you do with all of these very, very specific promises of the Old Testament? Well, to the first group, these Old Testament promises are completely rejected, been revoked. To the second group, they believe they've been fulfilled spiritually. So all of these things that were very physical now are spiritual realities. The third group, best way you can say, is very complicated. It's complicated because there is a truth that there is a lot of spiritual fulfillment that took place. However, there still is this idea that they will be brought back into the land, and those promises that are very clear and specific will take place. And then you have this fourth group. They just see Israel as it's all taking place right now. It's taken place. All of these promises will come true. Then you have this question. Well, what do we do with them today? How do we view the nation Israel today? Like, how should we talk about them? How should we view them? How should we discuss them on political platforms? Because they're being discussed, and some of you guys are jumping hook, line, and sinker into some trash. So what do we think about it? Number one, the first group would say Israel is demonic. They're the ones that crucified Christ, and they're just inspired by demons right now. Some people, the second group, would just say, well, just like America, they're secular. They're just any political organization. For the dispensational view, it's complicated. Because there is truth, they're going to come back into the land as a secular nation. They're going to have secular laws. They're not going to be believers. And then, in time, God will redeem His people. And then, for the fourth group, they're just superior. No matter what they do, they should be supported. They're always right. That's just current stuff. My personal opinion on this, first and foremost, I want to say this. First and foremost, we must be very careful not to stand in judgment over a nation that God called His beloved for thousands of years. Be very careful that you're not standing in ground that you have no right to stand on. Number two, I have to skip ahead because I don't have a ton of time, but I got 3 pages of something I wanted to talk about. I think I'll just put it in a blog, but there's this. Here's what I was going to say. Do you guys know what happened after the wise men came? There's this thing called slaughter of the innocents, where all babies 2 and under were murdered. Why? Because there's this weird anti-Semitic bent all through history. It's this historical hatred that you can read about it in Revelation. I have a whole list of things that are unbelievable. And even last year, at the end of last year, they said the anti-Semitism in the world has risen astronomically. But I'm not going to get into that right now because we got to deal with the text. So let's go to the text. And all I wanted to say is if Satan's not done with hating Israel, he must know that God's not done with Israel either. Which brings us back to the question of Paul. What is his answer to 11:1? Did God, according to 11:1, reject His people? Did He? Did He reject His people? And what we're going to see is Paul is very clear. Look what he says here. He says, in the NIV, he takes the Greek, it's a very emphatic phrasing, and he says, no, by no means. By no means. We might say it like this. Did God dispense of Israel? Not a chance. Or even more updated. No way, Jose. No, He didn't. This is why, I believe we must be very careful to say the church has replaced Israel. Be very careful. Because Paul didn't believe they were just done. Well, look at what it says here. I asked then, did God reject His people? The question here is, what does this phrase, His people, mean? Doesn't that mean the church? Isn't that what he's referring to? No. In context, His people is about the nation Israel. Look at this quote. I found this quote in some of my reading. The phrase, his people, comes after the connecting word then. See, so look at verse 1. I ask then. Then is a connecting word to what preceded it, which refers to 10:21. What's 10:21 talking about? But concerning Israel, he says, all day long I have held up my hands to a disobedient and obstinate people. This clearly is talking about national Israel. So even in unbelief, they are still his people. Translation, God's not done with Israel. So you could actually make the case, you could make this logical case, that by using the phrase, his people, Paul's point has been proven, meaning they are seen as his people. So if they're seen as his people, aren't they his people? Then what he does is he basically is going to say his ultimate proof of this is verse 5. Ultimate proof that he's not done with his people is he has kept a remnant. So I'm going to talk about remnant doctrine. See, look at verse 5. So too, at the present time, that means at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace. This is known as remnant doctrine. Remnant, in this context, and actually all through the Old Testament you'll find this word. Remnant refers to a small group of Jewish believers that are not saved by strict observance to the law. They're saved by God's grace. That's why verse 6 is there. It's very clear. And if by grace, then it cannot be based on works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. All through the Old Testament, you'll see people like David say, God doesn't want sacrifice. You know what he wants? He wants mercy. He wants a broken and contrite heart. In other words, it's not by law, it's not by obedience to the law is a man saved. He's saved by the mercy of God. That's what the remnant believes. So for Paul, salvation, you could say it like this, grace is the foundation of salvation. That's where it begins. And it's also the sufficiency for salvation. It carries you all the way to the end, till eternity. Not works, as he says here, because if it was by works, grace would no longer be grace. So the remnant believes in grace. And they're a key component in understanding how clear it is that God did not forsake his people. Listen to this quote, and I'm going to jump off this quote. And again, I'm asking you to think with me because this is in the Bible, so we got to deal with it. So here's the quote. The doctrine of the remnant of Israel means that there will always be some who believe within the Jewish nation as a whole. In truth, you could say there have always been two Israels. Israel the whole and Israel the remnant. Ethnically, the two are the same, but spiritually they are not. So what Paul's doing is he's going to say, because there's a remnant, that is proof that God hasn't finished with Israel. And he says, let me give you first proof. Number one, use me as an example. Look what he says in 11, 1 and 2. I ask then, did God reject his people? No. No way, Jose. No. I am an Israelite myself. I'm a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. God didn't reject his people. I like what one writer says. If it is true that God has cast off Israel, then not even Paul would have been saved because he is part of Israel. That's what he's saying. I'm a Jew. I'm a Jew of the Jew. I'm a Jew of the Jew of the Jews. And I believe he was a member of the remnant. So the second proof he gives is that God didn't even cast away his people during one of the worst times in the history of Israel. One of the most backslidden times was during Elijah, the prophet's time, and the kings. During Elijah's lifetime, the majority of the nation Israel did not believe, and they were idolaters. That's why you have Mount Carmel, where 450 prophets of Baal went against him alone. No other Jews stood up. Look at what he says in 3, 4, and 5. Verse 2. God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. Don't you know what Scripture says in a passage about Elijah, that prophet? how he appealed to God against Israel. Lord, they've killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I'm the only one left. And they're trying to kill me. I am the last guy. And what was God's answer to him? You know what, Elijah? I have reserved for myself 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. I got people. Don't worry about it, Elijah. You're not the only one. Final proof of this is he's going to go through these prophecies. So if you look at verse 7 through 10, do you see quotes? So he's quoting Deuteronomy, he's quoting Isaiah, he's quoting Psalm 69, and what he's saying is God prophesied ahead of time that the Jews would be hardened. Look at verse 7. What then? What the people of Israel sought so earnestly, they did not attain, the elect among them did, but the others were hardened, as it is written. Hardened in this idea is they were callous to the life and the love of God. Their hearts were made hard, and God prophesied that would happen. And so if that happened by prophecy, then the prophecy of future restoration will come true. If he makes a promise, he fulfills his promise. Listen to the future restoration of the book of Zechariah and tell me if this is Israel. Zechariah 12 and 13. I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So the house of David, inhabitants of Jerusalem, sounds Jewish to me. A spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they've pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for an only child. Who's the one they've pierced? Interesting. And grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. On that day, the weeping in Jerusalem will be as great as the weeping of Hadid Ramon in the plain of Megiddo. On that day, a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity. So in other words, God prophesies that Israel will be hardened. They were hardened. God also is prophesying they will be awakened. So they will be awakened. That's why you have 11 through 29. Look at how it climaxes in verse 29, Romans 11:29. God's gifts, his promises, are irrevocable. I was talking to somebody about why this is important. He gave us promises all through Romans 5, 6, 7, and 8. If he does not fulfill his promises for Israel, why should I expect him to fulfill Romans 5, 6, 7, and 8? Something to think about. In conclusion, this one writer says, the very existence of a believing Jewish remnant is clear evidence that God has not cast away his people. In fact, it's like a deposit on something you want to purchase. He's going to come back and get it. So instead of using the existence of a minority of believers as evidence God has cast off his people, in reality, it's evidence he has not. And by the way, if you do research on it, it's very interesting. Those who have been called into the missionary field to evangelize Jewish peoples are reporting that the number of Messianic Jews turning to Christ, has never been larger. There are estimates from 350,000 to 1.5 million true Jewish believers worldwide. It's amazing. So what are we to learn from all of this? Because it's kind of complicated. What are we to learn from it? One simple truth. When God makes a promise to you, when he makes a promise, he will specifically fulfill it no matter how bleak it may look. And that just brings me to my A slide. And I want you to think through this. This is for you personally. It's meditating on Elijah. I think we need to learn something from his example, especially when things seem bleak, because they did for Elijah. In the story of Elijah, this poor guy was the only one who stood up against the prophets of Baal. Again, like I said, 450 on a mountaintop to one man. One man. And there were no other Jewish prophets that stood with him. He was all alone. After he won, because God showed up in a miraculous way, he was depressed. He felt like he was the only one who actually cared. And after this big victory, Jezebel still went after him to hunt him down because she wanted him dead. So Elijah ran away. He ran away and he hid under a broom tree. It says he lied down and he cried out to God. I would say he whined out to God. And in 1 Corinthians 19:10 and 14, he whines about it twice. He's upset. I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. I call this the last prophet standing syndrome. It is when you think you are the only one around you that really is living for God. Everybody else is a hypocrite. Bunch of hypocrites, but not me. It's lonely out here. The only one. You're the only one serving. You're the only one sacrificing. I think in a way, a strange way, that's why a lot of people have written off Israel, because they think we evangelical Americans have loved God like nobody's ever loved him. It's kind of arrogant. But God corrected Elijah as he's drowning in his own self-righteous pity and told him not to worry because he had more people that could take his place. And in my humble opinion, as you meditate on this, I also think this whining was the beginning of the end of Elijah's ministry. God's like, okay, all right. If it's such a burden to you, I can get somebody else to do the job. So be very, very careful how you judge the faith of others. God always has his people in the shadows, waiting. And guess what? And I know people won't like this. He doesn't need you. He doesn't. I have to say this to myself all the time. Chris, he really doesn't need you. He wants to use you. He really does. He wants to use you, but he doesn't have to use you. So don't let depression and self-righteous pity make you bitter and judgmental and think you're all alone, because there's many good people God has waiting in the wings. Like you won't believe some of the people in this church. The reason, you know why you don't know what good people, how many good people we have? The reason why we don't hear about the good people, and this is what makes me crazy when even the secular world whines about the church, the reason you won't hear about good people is because they live by a principle. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand's doing. So good people shut up about their goodness. And what happens, it's not broadcast, but they're everywhere. Will, aren't they everywhere? Final consideration. I want you to look at verse 11. This is what I want to end on. Because I'll be honest with you, I'm reading this passage and I'm saying to myself, this has nothing to do with Kent City. So what? Why should we spend so much time talking about Israel? I want to hear from God. What does he want me to do in Michigan? Because it's cold up here in Michigan. I'd love to be in Israel down by the Jordan River. Well, look at verse 11, my friend. Look at verse 11. Again I ask. So it's kind of like the bookend of 11:1. Again I ask. Did they stumble so as to fall beyond recovery? No, not at all. Rather, because of their transgression, because they've been sidelined, because of their transgression, salvation has come to the Gentiles to make Israel envious. This is about you. Well, let me put it like this. I had it really kind of cool in my slide. I wanted to come up like Star Wars to be impressive, but it's just a click and the whole thing comes up. I had it moving up. I wanted to impress Josh Whitehead. He would have loved it. But look at it like this. Their hardening, that's the Jews hardening to the gospel, to Christ, their hardening is for our awakening. And our awakening is to make them jealous. As I said earlier, Israel's been benched, and now you're on the field. So let me ask you this, and this is the crux of the whole matter. This matters more than anything. If anyone saw your walk with Christ right now, would they be jealous? Does the good news in your life look like good news, or does it look like bad news? After watching you for a month, would anyone want your Savior? I was just talking with someone this week, and they asked me the question, Chris, how do you get people to live for Christ? Because it seems like no one really is these days. And I mean, not to fault them, it's a great question, but you notice it has a little bit of the last prophet standing residue. It's in all of us. Here's my answer to that question. How do you get people to really live for Christ? And this is more for me than anybody, I'm just telling you. Here it is. If you find no delight in God, don't expect people to find delight in God through you. We are on this earth to make people jealous. So, are you?